iTestify is about testifying of what Jesus Christ has done and can do in each of our lives. Through testimony of people just like you and through study of His Word, our prayer is to encourage each follower of Christ to be a light in this world. So let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Matthew 5:16.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of iTestify. Thank you for joining us. We have with us our friend Dean, who's coming from Weimar, where he studies theology and is also a Bible teacher. If you're not sure how to spell Weimar, he's actually wearing a shirt with the spelling on it. And he's going to be sharing with us his testimony about how he came into the faith. Dean, thanks for joining us.
Thanks
and
for having
looking
me.
forward to hearing how God has brought you in. So why don't you give us a little background about where you grew up and...
Sure. Well, I was born in the Republic of Ireland, which is not actually a part of the United Kingdom, although many people think it is. And I was born into a Roman Catholic family. My whole family, everyone was Catholic. And it was quite nominal, but my grandparents were very strict. And we lived literally a stone's throw away from the church. And they were good friends with the local priest, and they would, the priest and my granddad would go drinking together and stuff. And, we're obviously not talking about water either. So that was kind of the background. I lived in Ireland until I was 8. And then my mom, myself, and my younger brother, we moved to England because of various strange circumstances.
So do you have a British accent or Irish accent?
Well, I had an Irish accent.
Okay.
And now I think my accent is just this amalgamation of moving around too much. So it's hard to discern. I get a lot of people come and say, "Oh, you're from South Africa." I'm like, no. "Oh, New Zealand." No. "Australia." No. Where else do they possibly speak English? So I moved to England when I was 8 years old, just myself, my mom, and my younger brother. Yeah.
And so you grew up in a Catholic home, but it sounds, was it a devout Catholic home?
Like I said, only from my grandparents. In fact, once we moved, there was just the three of us, and then my mom's sister and her children were the only ones over in England. And we continued to go to church because my grandma would call every Sunday afternoon and ask if we had went, and what we had heard. And of course, you can never remember because you just say the same thing all the time. And the sermon's like 2 minutes, and you don't even know what's happening until it's over. So that took place, that scenario developed for maybe a good 4 or 5 years of just having to go to church on Sunday just because that phone call was going to come. And eventually I just got really bored. My mom was also bored. We were just doing it because we felt like we had to. I'd bring like my video game consoles to the church, and my mom was fine with that as long as I stayed quiet, which happened most of the time. Most of the time I was quiet, but there's odd moments where I'd be like, "Wow." And, I didn't feel like I fit in so well. And so I convinced my mom to stop going, to stop attending when I was like 13. I was like, "Let's forget this. We'll deal with grandma. We don't need to be here. Neither of us believe in this. It's a waste of time. Sunday, Saturday I play football after school for the whole week. Sunday can just be a day where we relax. Why do we have to go to church?" So we stopped. Yeah.
Wow. So she was obviously didn't take much convincing either.
Oh, no. It was like first suggestion, "Oh, that's a good idea." I never had any other good ideas. Everything else I was wrong. But this one was a good idea.
Okay.
So we stopped.
All right. So now you're 13. How many years did you go in before you came back, and what initiated that? What brought you back?
Well, I was 13 when I stopped. And I went through school. I had no belief in God. I couldn't say for certain that there was no God. But I didn't feel inclined really either way. And so I went through school. And when I was 15 years old, I met this girl, and she was a Seventh-day Adventist. And I've never heard of Seventh-day Adventists before. And I liked her a lot. So I thought, I have to make an impression. So I went on Wikipedia, and
Research.
Googled Seventh-day Adventist. And there's that really archaic picture of Ellen and James White up in the right-hand corner, and I was reading through it. I was like, okay, I'm going to like learn these key buzzwords, you know? So when she comes up, like, yeah, I know Ellen White, and I know all these, I know that, you know, the Adventist Church has this many members worldwide, and all of these facts that really don't mean anything. And that was kind of my introduction to Adventism. And it was with, you know, a relationship with a young lady who was an Adventist, but she was in the church, but she wasn't really in the church. Hence why, you know, she would go out with someone like me. So anyways, that relationship didn't last at all. And about 3 years went by before we met again. And I remember, in fact, when we were first dating, when I was 15, she was 13, her dad called me and was like, you need to leave my daughter alone. She's too young, you're too young, all this kind of stuff. And then she broke it off. So he said to me on the phone, he's like, if you're still interested, come back in 3 years. And so I was like, 3 years? I'm 15. That's 1/5 of my life. I mean, who's waiting 3 years? But 3 years later, we meet up again, and we get into a relationship again. I go to see her dad because
he was surprised.
He called a meeting, you know. He's like, I want to see you. So I went, and he told me essentially, his English was really bad. I found out later that this is not what he meant to say, but it's what he said anyways, which was basically, you can date my daughter if you go to church just once. Now, what he actually meant to say, which I later found out, was you can date her only when you become a Christian. But, you know, things get lost in translation. So I was like, great. It's like a birthday, you know, like this is the one present that I wanted more than anything. So, sure, I'll go. I went to church once. It was a Seventh-day Adventist church in London. It was very lively. It was a youth program, so it was a Friday night. I think it was called Friday Night Project. And it was very, like, bouncy and loud and a lot of, you know, the whole program was just singing, and then there were testimonies at the end. And I heard a testimony. I sat there. I felt like, you know, the ugly duckling in a sense. The whole church, and this is quite the case for the Adventist Church in the United Kingdom, is Afro-Caribbean. You know, there was mass immigration from the West Indies and the Caribbean and so forth. And so if you're an Adventist in England, you're black. And so I walked into this program, the only white person in there, the only one. And so there's myself sitting there, and then this Muslim friend that also came. And so we're just kind of sitting there just like, okay, and there's this girl behind me. I just remember she was just singing and riffing and going on. And I was like, oh, this is so annoying. I don't want to be here. But I heard a testimony right at the end. I thought they were trying to... There was this woman that said, you know, I had cancer, and then I prayed, and God took away my cancer. And I was like, really? Just like that? And then there was another lady that said she didn't have any money for food for her kids, and she was walking to church one day, and she found, you know, 50 pounds. And I was like, I feel like this is a setup. I feel like people have brought me in here to tell me these exaggerated stories to try and make me believe that God is real.
It's like multi-level marketing.
Right, you know, I was like, wow, this is pretty good, guys, that you managed to put all this together so seamlessly. But I did actually hear a testimony that night, and it's a long story, but I left that church that night with this overwhelming feeling that I was going to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And I couldn't explain it, and I despised that feeling, but it was there. And I was like, this is so strange. So that was really my first kind of venture back into church.
Did you keep seeing the girl, or did you just
I did keep seeing the girl. I said, look, I held up my end of the bargain, you know. I went to church just once. So I did. And like I said, she was quite nominal. But God is good. The Lord used her to bring me into the church, and then used me to bring her to Christ. So she got baptized a few years later after we went to an evangelism school in England, and now we're married.
Oh.
Yeah, so God is good. You know, it's strange how these things happen and how they work themselves out, but they do. They do.
So what was the turning point? I mean, you left that experience thinking, I have a feeling I'm going to be a Seventh-day Adventist, although you despised it.
Right.
You didn't have to go back to church again.
I didn't.
You checked that off the list. So what started?
It was just, I mean, now we'd call it conviction, but I didn't know, what that meant really. So I decided I was going to buy a Bible just to make sure that it wasn't actually true.
Oh, I can relate to that.
Yeah, so I bought one, and I had to wait a few days for it to come in the mail. Amazon Prime it let me down that time. And I remember, like I said, there's my mom and my younger brother, and at this time my mom was married to a Muslim. And so reading the Bible just wasn't something that happened in our house. So I had to hide it, and then at night I would take it out and pull my covers over my head, and I had a little book light on my Bible, and I would just kind of read through. Started with Matthew. I was reading King James Version, so I really didn't have any understanding of what I was actually reading. Contrary to popular belief, we don't speak like that in England.
That's what I was going to say. You didn't get to know that.
Yeah, where's all the these and thous?
Yeah, I missed the Shakespearean class growing up. But yeah, I started reading to prove that it wasn't true. And the more I read, the more I was convinced. I wouldn't say that I was converted, I was convinced. And so,
anything in particular that
yeah, I just thought that it's ridiculous to write stories like this in the Bible. Like stories of, people being around God and just constantly messing up. I was like, if I was going to write a story about how good God was, then everyone would just
Be like robots.
everyone would go, oh, is this what Jesus is saying to do? Okay, then we better do it because this is God and we all obey God. But really, everything he said, they just had this knack for doing the opposite and for failing. And never once did he get frustrated. We're told never once did he even speak a rude or harsh word. And I was just like, if this guy is real, this is incredible. Yeah, so my
you look into the historicity of Jesus even existing? Like, do you start looking into the fact that regardless of the identification as God or not, but he truly was alive as a person. There's no doubt.
Sure.
Did you
No,
do that?
I found that out much later. But once I was like really puzzled about, because this wasn't the God I'd heard of in my religious education classes at school. But my now wife and her sister, they invited me to their house for Bible studies. We studied Daniel and Revelation and the sanctuary. I remember we had to build a sanctuary with household items that we found around the house, stuff like that.
That's cool.
To kind of understand. And then I went to a church service, this evangelistic series that was happening with these two young men preaching. They were maybe 4 or 5 years older than myself. And this was a completely foreign concept to me. For me, church was for old people. You couldn't go in unless you had a few gray hairs or you were the child of someone that had such. So I go in, I see these two young people preaching, and I don't really understand what they're saying, but I could tell that they believed it from the way that they were sharing it. I was like, this is incredible. Like, there's young people that believe the Bible and try and live it out. Like, this is a completely foreign concept to me. So that really kind of encouraged me to take it seriously. And a few weeks later, I went to another evangelistic series, and it was a female pastor that had come from Oakwood to do a 2-week series in what's now my home church. And 1 week through that series, I was like, I'm getting baptized. Like, this is a complete transformation, but I'm getting baptized. And I had to, I guess, I was dishonest, so we could call it lying. I had to lie to go to church. Because it wouldn't, I couldn't get permission from my mom. Oh, Mom, I'm going to go to church. It's like, no, you're not. Like, if we go to church, we go to church on Sundays. And Saturday was football day, or you would say soccer day. And so I used to leave in my soccer outfit, with my backpack, with church clothes in my backpack, so that I could get far away enough from home and then change and go to church. Because it wasn't acceptable. It wasn't acceptable for me to have a Bible in the house either.
It's the opposite, where you're going to have, I'm going to go to church, and you wear your church clothes, and you got your soccer clothes in the back, and you can switch out. So
yeah,
it's just funny.
yeah, it is.
So you were playing hooky from football, didn't even go, and wanted to go to church instead.
Yep. And I done that weekly as much as I could without it becoming too obvious, because again, another foreign concept to me was that Adventists just go to church for the whole day. Like, we would go to church for an hour and you're done. But it's like, no, we have Sabbath school, and then we have church service, and then we have potluck, and then we have AY, and then we have outreach, and then we have socials, and it's just like, this is a full experience. So there's only so much I can make up to my parents. But they did find out. My mom had remarried by this time.
How old were you then?
18,
18, okay.
18, 19.
So this is within a year period from the time that you went and met your previous girlfriend.
Yes.
And so you met with the family, they took you you went to church, and then you just went back to back to back very quickly. You're reading through the Bible along the way, and you're baptized within this time period.
Yep.
Oh, so very fast.
My mom found the Bible in the house. She was very upset. She's like, what is this? So I had to tell her, you know. And I told her, look, I said, I'm getting baptized next week. And she was like, no, you're not. And I said, I remember thinking to myself, but that wasn't, I didn't ask a question. You know, I didn't ask, can I? It was a statement. I'm saying I am, you know. And we had this big discussion in the front room for about an hour. And my mom and my stepdad were very adamant that they weren't going to be weren't going to have any part of this. But by the end of the conversation, it's funny, I remember praying. Whilst they're speaking to me, I remember just sitting down there listening and just going like, mid-conversation. And I don't know if I prayed this out loud or not, but I remember my prayer was just, Lord, help this woman. That was my prayer. And by the end of that conversation, she was like, okay, so what do I wear to your baptism? Wow. Yeah, and she was there, and I have, you know, eyewitness accounts that she was, you know, in tears as it was all happening. And she's still not a Christian, but, you know, in the Lord's time.
I'm just curious, what was your opposition to you keeping your faith in any way? I mean, it wouldn't really affect her in any way. But.
Yeah, you know, it doesn't make sense. That's the thing, it doesn't, because shortly after I was baptized, we kind of just we locked heads at home, and what I was told was that, you know, they didn't like that I had changed the way that I speak. You know, I wasn't swearing and that kind of stuff. I wasn't bringing random people home at night. I wasn't eating the foods that they were eating anymore. I didn't have the same friend circles, and so eventually we just locked heads, and they told me that I would have to choose between family and God. So I had to leave home shortly after I was baptized. And I moved in with a friend that I just met from the church, and I lived with him and his family for 2 years, and they really showed me what real Christianity is. You know, they took me in on the day that I was the day after I was kicked out, and I never had to pay rent. You know, I never had to pay for food or anything like that. They just took me in. My friend moved out of his room, gave me his room. He slept under a desk in his dad's video editing room.
Wow. Could have just slept in the same bed. I mean, I'd be okay with it.
Yeah, and I was fine with that as well, but, you know, went the extra mile.
Wow, you really did.
Yeah.
So then after the 2 years, I mean, you decide that you want to go into ministry?
Well, there was a few things that happened in between. So my girlfriend's mom didn't believe that I had actually converted. So she sent her to Brazil to get her away from me with her sister. And it was then, because she was kind of, you know, she was my rock in that sense, where she had brought me in and so on and so forth. And she was gone, and so I had to really make this real for myself, you know. And there was one point, I remember a turning point. I believe that I was converted, but there was you know, still a long way to go, and there came this turning point maybe about 6 months into being a Christian. I was reading Matthew chapter 6, the Lord's Prayer. Or it was, I guess, John 17 is the Lord's Prayer, but Jesus teaching the disciples how to pray in Matthew chapter 6. And he starts off with these words, Our Father. And it just hit me. I'd read it many times before, but it just really hit me this time I read it, and I was like, okay, so God is my Father. And I just struggled with that concept. I look back now and I know why I struggled, is because I didn't really have a father growing up. And I had this picture in my head that, like, God the Father was kind of just all about justice and judgment, and he was just willing to, you know, squash me for my sins. But Jesus was kind of holding back the Father, like, no, you know, don't kill him, my blood, my blood, you know. And it's such an inaccurate picture the relationship within the Godhead. But there was an underlying reason as to why I struggled with God being this father figure. When my mom was 24 years old, she was engaged. Actually, she was 23. She was 23 years old, and she was engaged. And she was at a house party drinking and doing all sorts of other stuff. So her fiance being at the party was like, look, I've got to go. I've got to leave. I've got work in the morning. And she was very adamant that she was going to stay. So he spoke to her best friend and was like, look, when it gets late, when everything is wrapping up, just make sure she gets home. And where the house was, there was just like this big field in between the house and my mom's house, or she was staying with her parents. And so it gets to like 3 or 4 in the morning, and then her fiance's friend is like trying to usher her out, and they get in the car. So she's driving home, and she realizes, even though she's under the influence, she realizes that she's not going home. Mm-hmm. And so her fiance's friend takes out this bottle of vodka and just smashes it over her head, and he rapes her in the field that was there. And that was how I was conceived in that moment, So I never had a father growing up. And I knew this from a very young age. I found out when I was like 10. And so for this whole time, I just thought, well, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have a purpose. I'm a mistake, essentially, was the feelings that I grew up with. And so that was tough. And so thinking of God as a father when I'd never really had a father, and my only conception of my father was what I had just explained, was really difficult. But I came to the passage in the scriptures where Peter was talking about forgiveness. How often should we forgive them? 7 times?
7.
And Jesus is like, well, 70 times 7. And he gives the parable that essentially the moral of such is, you're not going to be forgiven if you're not willing to forgive others. And so that was really the deciding point in my life, is whether or not I was going to be a true Christian, was whether I could forgive my father for what he had done to my mother and to me. And that was probably the toughest decision I had to make up until that point, and maybe even since. But that's where Christianity became real for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how did you just do that in your heart, or did you?
Yeah, I've never had the opportunity to meet him, but I had this hatred, like this really strong hatred, prior to kind of coming to this realization. And once God and I had this experience where he was speaking to me, saying, look, like it says in Psalm 68:5, that he is a father to the fatherless, I was like, that's what I want, and that's what I need, And so, yeah, I made that decision in my heart, and from that moment, there was this peace that came up. The hatred was gone, and it hasn't come back. There's still pain, but the hatred, the feelings of anger and resentment, and the desire for vengeance has gone, and I believe that God took that,
Praise
so,
God.
yeah.
So then, we have a few minutes left. How did you get to where you are now? I mean, being a Christian and being a theology study, student is different.
Well, I started going to church, like I said, after I was baptized, I was going every week. And the very first week I was there, I was having potluck with the young people. And I came into the church believing that, time was running out. I made it in by the hair on my chinny chin chin. Like, I've just got in, like, things are wrapping up, surely. But there was this air of apathy, and that just shocked me. And so I was like, again, you have to make a decision. Am I just going to warm the pew, for when the real people come in and want to get things done, or am I going to just do whatever God asked me to do? And so they asked me to preach at my church about 2 months after I was baptized. Again, I knew that was completely God's will. I did that, and things just took off from there. I was invited to speak here and there, and I started an online ministry with the friend that took me in at the time, and we started to travel, to do mission trips and evangelistic series, and that
was Preaching Place?
Right, Preaching Place, yeah. So it was just a whirlwind of, like, I just never really got to stop. And I ran from the idea of studying theology because I never being a pastor was never something that I considered or wanted to do. But again, I felt God calling. And I remember the day that I proposed to my wife, it's like, baby, will you marry me? And she's like, yes. And I was like, great, but there's something I need to tell you now that you said yes. And God is calling me into ministry, and he's calling specifically to Weimar in California. And she just looked at me and said, are you sure that that's God's will? And I said, I'm sure. So, okay, let's go. So it took some time. We had a couple years to get ready and tie up loose ends. But yeah, we came. I'm almost finished now, and I have no idea what the Lord has in store next, but that's just how he's always kind of done it with me. It's like, I'll let you continue to go until right to the very last moment when I know I have your attention, and then I'll show you the next step. But you have to trust me before we get to that next step.
I think it's beautiful because, you're talking about how you felt like you were a mistake. You didn't have any purpose, and God has given you your entire life a new meaning, and it's given you purpose.
And I think that's the gospel.
Yeah.
Jesus talked about heaven not just being something that we're going to get at the end, but he's, to those that have lost their mothers, their fathers, their homes, their jobs for his sake, he said that they'll receive 100-fold, both here and there. And I've really felt that the kind of restoration that the gospel brings in my own life.
A verse that you had brought up, I was hoping we could look at it in Ephesians 2, chapter 10.
Yeah, and this verse really speaks to me because, like I said, growing up feeling like I was a mistake. Romans 8 says that all these things will work, to the good, but that didn't really help me, if I'm honest. I was like, okay, it will work out for the good, but right now I'm in the bad. But here in Ephesians 2:10, he says that we are Christ's workmanship. There can't be a mistake. With God, there are no mistakes. There's only purpose. Right. And so learning that this was, for the whole time, he had worked through these avenues of evil to create something for good. And that he was going to use this for his glory and for his purpose, that we have been created to be his workmanship. That, for me, was like, okay, I'm not a mistake. I'm not an accident. Like, there's purpose.
Amen. For us all.
Absolutely powerful. I'm so into your testimony. It's like, I wish I could hear even more and more.
Right.
Because God doesn't make mistakes,
That's right. That's
He makes everything beautiful in His time, and we're so thankful to hear that testimony. I think there's also a verse in Revelation that says something like, "They overcame the dragon by, what was it like?
By the word of his testimony.
By the word of his testimony. Blood of the Lamb, and by the word of his testimony."
Yeah.
And here is clearly a testimony that has really overcome. We're so thankful for that.
God is good.
Unfortunately, though, we are running out of time.
Yep.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Dean, for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me.
And for those of you guys who are watching, for more episodes like this, go to LLBN.tv, and on that website you can see more. But with that being said, thank you for joining us, and until then, God bless, and we'll see you next time.